Hi, everybody. I'm John Canning with Digital Domain. I'm the executive producer of neither film, nor television, nor commercials. I actually fill the rest of that, or manage to do the visual effects to all the other different screens. So I was going to talk a little bit about bringing characters to life, digital humans, virtual humans, however you want to phrase them. Look back into the looking glass of where we started with some of these things and how we progress with them. How many of you saw Titanic? How many remember this cringe-worthy moment? Yeah, that part where that guy is smacked into the propeller and you hear that? That was a digital human. No real actors were hurt in the hitting of that propeller at that time. But even back then, digital humans. Very simplistic, very quick flash, probably didn't have that much of a face. But again, building a digital construct for storytelling because you needed to fill a gap, you wanted to do something, and that's where we start to see it. So if we start thinking about going back into our minds, digital humans, this virtual human, creating a character that fills in a role in a story isn't necessarily new. We just start improving and keep improving the ways we create them, the way we fill them into the stories, the way we drive them, and the stories they can tell. Back in 2000, sure enough, Maya was created. And we got called at that time to create a digital assistant for Motorola. Maya, we delivered the product and they said, it looks too real. Could you make her look more avatarish? So coming into this. Now the funny part is that all Maya did was the face of that digital assistant. She didn't do anything. She just looked that way. And of course, it was an audio assistant back in 2000. But if you start to think now and you say, what is the face of Siri? What is the face of Alexa? What is the face of Google Assistant? You start thinking about that. We've always wanted to talk about that. We've had chatbots forever, and then you had that chatbot on that service page, that website for your cable company where you were trying to figure out why your cable doesn't work, and a little chatbot pops up, and then there's a nice picture of Debbie right on top of it, right? You have no idea if you're chatting with Debbie, but your mind instantly goes to that's Debbie because they put a picture of Debbie there, and now you're chatting with somebody in who knows where about the fact that your cable doesn't work. And of course, you curse Debbie, not that person that is chatting with you, because that's her picture. And I do feel sorry for her. Hopefully, she was stock photography. But some of the methods that we used, a lot of hard work, right? A lot of people getting involved in different methodology, taking photographs of talent, then manually creating that head. A ton of artists. Some of the other subsequent things, I'll talk about some of the artists and the numbers of artists who were used to make those. Facial response, if any. And then very, very simple lighting, constructing that lighting environment. All these techniques, labor intensive to create a vision of a person, right? It still was easier to take a photograph and use a real person. Benjamin Button. Had the honor of creating Benjamin Button. But there were a lot of things that went into that. And in fact, when you see Brad here doing his work, that was months after principal photography in a very dark room with really no clue of what Brad was acting to. And in fact, I was talking to the VFX supervisor on this project, and he said, you know what? You get a brief glimpse of Brad there. The artist had to go in and give the face emotion. Because Brad pretty much played that straight because he was in a dark room at the time, listening to lines, just giving a performance. He wasn't acting really, he wasn't putting his effort into it, and they were having to mold these things after the fact. Started with about 13 artists, boiled down to about 6 artists because it was all about a person who could manually make this happen in all natural ways. Very laborious, time intensive. So we're improving the process, right? We improve cameras to capture that facial motion so that we have the artist can sit there and do this back and forth. Coming up with an automated system to give different parts of my face ways to control it in a consistent way. Starting to potentially get away from the marker base. Starting to use a light stage down the street, and a number of them, so we can now come up with a comprehensive way that your face works and down to the pore level. To look at your face in ways you never want to look at your face ever, ever again. And about 155 people involved in that process to create that digital head. Time intensive, expensive, and laborious to create one head, right? Which again, is not a thing that we're looking at. As I think somebody later on today, I think Ryan's going to be here from Artie, they talk about, there will be more virtual humans than humans. And when we start getting into that kind of concept, it's like, how do you create them? How do you start creating them in a way that doesn't take 155 people and 325 shots? So you progress a little farther, and now we start talking about not only just creating these artificial people, but then turning back the dials of time, like we did with Benjamin Button. And then starting to play with head replacement in more and more action scenes. If you know this and you've seen it, you probably are critics of it. You can start pointing out the little bits that, like things that bug you. Notice the lighting isn't always consistent. There's certain reasons for that. The mouth, if you look deep into his mouth, it's not going to be impressive. You notice he's not going, check my tonsils, please. But slowly this process, now this is a digital head placed on a physical body, right? So you took the actor and then we're just mapping that head on there. So that is a cheat process, if you will. Why create a whole body if you've got a perfectly good body and you just need to make that head look younger? Right? So you start to think about these processes when we're talking about creating digital humans is, what do you need that digital human for? What are they going to be doing? Do you need to create all of them? We start talking about volumetric capture versus mocap versus creating, it's like, what are you trying to do with it? What is your end output? So I get more phone calls about people that want to create holograms that don't actually know what a hologram is and don't actually want to do it once I explain what it is. So they're like, oh, I just wanted to create a digital person. I'm like, great. But this is one of the reasons we get a lot of phone calls. But this was the process after Tupac had died. They wanted to bring him back at this concert. Now, the hologram is a Pepper's Ghost effect, right? That's you shining a projector on a screen, you have that angle of incidence, and then you can have that ghosting effect behind you. But the reality is that it was taking a physical actor, creating Tupac's head now from pictures, he's no longer with us, or he wasn't with us at the time, and then mapping those two together and creating a series of performances. But the problem is they're all very rote. It's on rails, right? Now, you can do it in such a way that this performance, he does call outs to Snoop. Snoop goes, hey! Good news is Snoop had decent timing at that moment, right? Now, you can again fake that kind of performance, because again, you can make that, this is on rails, it just goes. But there's no reason not to then create a digital character that you create a short series of performances and you play back, right? So one of those fine gentlemen would be back there literally playing it back. I could be interacting with a hologram right now, and as long as we both read the same script, we could do it, right? So again, these things are, taking Benjamin Button, a performance that happened after the fact that we created content, right? You look at something like Tupac, where somebody had died and you're creating them after the fact. But how do you then enable actors to perform more in the moment? How do you enable people, in the case of the Beast here, to be able to act on the stage and start combining those performances? So this is an example of the ICT Light Stage in creating that full map so we can map a digital head on there. Now the actor in this case still did a physical performance and then recorded a secondary performance, but what we're now doing is taking that secondary performance and you're mapping it to the head, right? So he's driving that head after the fact, after we create this synergy between what the actor is doing with a camera mounted and pointing at their face and how that drives and retargets, in the case, the Beast's head. But the problem with this is the actor said to him, still had to, what he thought, overact. He had to push the performance too hard. He couldn't just act, he had to overact, right? Now, you could just say, but that's the beast. It's kind of easy when it's a big horned thing that you're like, well, I really don't know how that acts. But what if you take a character and you create them and you know how they perform? Or you want to see their performance come through? Or you want to do complex and interesting shots? So how many of you realize that that shot of Wade right there, was that not of real Wade? It wasn't a trick. It was a digital human all the way through that shot. So now we're starting to play with the fact that you can get complex shots. You can mix and match. The look and the feel there is not trying to go for a different kind of look. It's just a natural look, but a complex shot. And combining those together. So again, we're perfecting these techniques as we go to more efficiently create these kind of images and tell these kind of stories. So ultimately, it culminated with the work that we did on Thanos. And here is where we're really starting to lean into the techniques of not hundreds of artists necessarily, not a laborious process of capturing performance. And in fact, when Josh Brolin did this performance, we did some tests with Josh. He saw it afterwards and realized he didn't actually have to overact. He could just be himself. So in the process of using machine learning, in the process of building the creature Thanos, and teaching the system how to map Josh's performance to Thanos, you run into that argument, and then a lot of people like to say, well, wait a minute, are you using AI and machine learning to put actors out of work? I would argue we're starting to enable actors to act again. Because Josh didn't have to overact. He delivered, in fact, very subtle performances that came through to the big purple guy. And that's where we start looking at these kind of things. Now, this is, in essence, a live driving of that performance. And he did the performance at the same time he was doing his physical performance. We were capturing the face. So now you start getting into a situation where you're enabling actors to act on stage, but then to be giant purple people. Purple people eaters, something like that. This is a slow process of starting to develop us. But you're like, but John, this is millions of dollars in an Avengers movie, and is everybody going to be doing this? And it starts getting into the conversation around fidelity and what you want to do with this. And I get more conversations that people are asking to create a virtual character, and then you start saying, what does that virtual character need to do? In this case, this virtual character, we were doing close-ups, right? There was that scene in the movie, he's looking at you, that's a real high-fidelity moment. But where is it going? Too often I see people trying to go high fidelity into low fidelity environments. Too often I see people that don't realize that if you're trying to do a quote-unquote hologram, it could be a perfectly fine live person doing a live action shoot against a green screen. Very low fidelity to bring that. You don't need to always create a digital character to then go to these different screens. We're going through a project right now where we're having the conversation of the fidelity of the character versus the delivery method, and you have those kinds of trade-offs. But all of this is leading up to this was what I call pre-rendered, right? A whole lot of work, rendering out frames, putting on a film, showing people. The next step is to think about doing this in real time. Right? So it's all well and good to create Thanos, to spend weeks, to render that out, push it on the frame. But now we're talking about characters that we want to control in real time. We want to interact with. So we took Doug, who is pretty much the guinea pig for everything we do. We own him. He's out there in the wild. We can use him for all sorts of things. You want to rent Doug, just let me know. He does bar mitzvahs and parties. But in this case, we started creating Doug. So let's see. We're going to see if the video plays. Video yes, video no, maybe. We'll go to this one. So this is Doug controlling himself in real time. There's a TED Talk about this. But in this case, creating Doug, the virtual double of Doug, and if I brought up some of the high-res screen images, we're really getting to the point where that real human and the digital human side by side are starting to look phenomenally close. Now, that's fine in a pre-rendered environment, but what we're starting to do is get phenomenally close in a real-time environment, in a game engine environment. And so in this case, Doug is driving himself. You notice there are no markers on Doug's face at this point because the system has been trained. We captured Doug, we created Doug in a real-time engine. The system was trained, and Doug is now driving himself. So Doug can put on the helmet cam, he can sit there and he can drive himself. He can create a performance, if you will. Then the next step is saying, well, actually, Doug can actually drive this performance from one city to another. Telepresence, right? You know, I was asked, like, what would I use 5G for? And I'm like, well, this, but because of lag. I want it because of the ability. You want to talk to Doug, you want to have a nice conversation with Doug, and you don't want that lag. But it's the same problem we had with telepresence, same problem we had with telephones, where you would call up somebody internationally and you'd have that stutter conversation with them, right? It's just the problem gets harder and harder as we're moving bits back and forth in fidelity, and now we're looking and we're having video and we're interacting. But this is Doug driving a live performance. Now, the interesting thing is that's all well and good, but Doug is Doug, and he's a handsome man, but not necessarily Josh Brolin. But the interesting thing is you can come over and Doug can drive an innumerable number of things over at the shop. Maybe even giant purple people, but we won't talk about that. Or 18-inch tall yellow furry creatures that were detectives in movies. Because we built a training set where the system knows how to take Doug's face and Doug's actions and translate them into that character. So we could do pre-recorded performances, that's all well and good. It's like doing the choice between doing live television and live to tape. Look, I've done a lot of live television. It's scary as hell. It's exhilarating, but if I don't have to, I don't want to, right? I love live to tape. Give me just a little bit of moment to correct that problem that I just cursed, and it just went out there, and God only knows what's going to happen to me now. Live to tape is great. Could do that with the game engine if I needed to. Maybe zhuzh it a bit, fix a few things. Or I can do live. Or I can now take that character. So Doug's showing up on an OLED screen back there, but Doug also drives the performance into a VR environment. I could take Doug into a game environment. So now when we talk about multiple uses of an IP, we're starting to achieve that moment where we can do different kinds of things with a character. And again, it's Doug as a human, but Doug could be another kind of creature. So in this case, and this is the pregnant pause, we're going to see if that starts moving. It gets more interesting if it moves. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the man in the back will play with the mouse and things will happen. Maybe he won't notice that I'm talking to him back there. Yeah. Oh, see? There you go. So this is Doug with the system trained, driving Elbor. Now, this is just the gray shapes of Elbor. He's fully textured at this point, and I'll go to that next. But once we trained a system, his facial expressions are mapped one-to-one into that environment, into that critter, which means he can drive multiple performances. And at SIGGRAPH recently, we were doing this. We had somebody in our office, Kenzie. Now, Doug is about 6-something, skinny as a rail, blinks a lot. Kenzie is that tall, lovable lady, very expressive, and she was driving Doug at the same time. Now, the fascinating thing is when you see two characters, two Dougs being driven. Now, if you didn't know Doug, you have no idea necessarily which one's the real one. And Kenzie actually could kind of act like Doug. But I know Doug. Kenzie does know Doug, right? She's not a good Doug. But the point being here is thinking about, as we create digital characters, what you know versus what you don't know, right? If you create a digital character of me, about half of you in this room would know if somebody else drove me because you're like, that's no John Canning. Maybe better, but it's no John Canning. If I create a digital character that you've never met before, like Elbor, you have no idea how that person's going to act, right? Now, this is Doug's performance, the same one that was beforehand. In a real-time engine, that's why it's moving around a bit. It's fully in a real-time engine, so you can sit there and play with it. But this is Doug's performance that was pre-recorded that just we swap back and forth between characters. So it starts getting into the point of, how do you drive characters and who can drive them? Multiple people could be trained up to drive Elbor, right, and be that character. And you wouldn't necessarily know. Now, Josh Brolin drove Thanos, and the interesting thing is if somebody else drove Thanos, it would probably not feel right. If you watch the movie, you'd be like, that's not Thanos. There's something different about it. In a very real circumstance of this, we did create that yellow fuzzy character in a real-time game engine. And one of those moments that was sort of a, oh yeah, we got notes back from the IP holder because they had looked at that yellow fuzzy character in the movie. It was pre-rendered. Then they looked at the fuzzy character in a performance. And they said, they don't move the same. And I said, you're right. One of them was hand-drawn animation, and the other one was powered by Ryan Reynolds. And guess what? Ryan Reynolds doesn't move the same way that the animated character that you love on TV does. Shocking, I know. But he is no Pikachu. Voice is a great Pikachu. And so it's suddenly this idea of, oh, I want to live drive a character. Well, that's great. But you have to understand the impacts of it. You have to understand what the human performance or the performance brings to it versus the rote, hand-cultured, created performance does. So all these things start to blend together into the different nuances of how do you create a character? How do you drive a character? What decisions you make to drive the character? The next step for this is driving it with an AI. Now, there are a lot of pieces that go into that if you start thinking about it. If you think about the virtual characters, a little Michaela. How many of you saw a little Michaela out there? How dynamic is she?
Not very.
She gives some of the most wooden performances I've ever seen when she finally got to a performance. I love the music video that basically happened around little Michaela, right? Like she was just kind of awkwardly standing there and the music video happened and you're like, that's odd. Creating a visual, not hard. A lot of companies. There are a bunch of companies, some of you here. Great, we can create that visual character. Powering and giving that character life, the next step, right? You know, Pete's going to come up and he's going to talk about an amazing virtual character they've created and how they've given that character life and the subtlety that they've given to that character. But I didn't know that character, right? So I don't have any preset expectations. But you have to add the voice into it. You have to have the emotions to it. As we look across the different virtual characters that have been created out there, what's interesting is you have a whole set of folks that are creating AI, behavioral engines, chatbots. They come from one direction. And then the folks in the visual world come from the other direction. And you can see that sometimes this part is the tough part. Sometimes it's got very interesting real reactions and very odd facial performance, you know, or vice versa. And creating that synergy. And then making the voice work, the mouth work the way you expect it. Because we're used to seeing faces. That's the problem here. I'm used to seeing Phil's face, and I know what his face does when he talks. If his face starts doing something different, it's not going to feel right to me. You know, the uncanny valley is real. But it's real from a visual standpoint. It's real from an auditory standpoint. So to get all of those pieces right and those subtleties is the next step of this. You know, creating a virtual character that you throw up on an Instagram, that's fine. The next step of making that have a life and a personality, that's the next step. You know, then the personality to interact and go beyond that. So if I go back to it for a second and think about Alexa or Google Assistant, when we have the chatbot, we have one expectation. We have that picture of Debbie in the chatbot, we have another expectation. How many of you interacting with your Siri or Google Assistant or Alexa, trying not to be biased in one way or another, have in your head some image of that person, right? Your mind has started to fill in the gap. You started to say to yourself, well, it's got a female voice, it must be female. What does that look like? And then as you go further, now when we start to give visual references to that, are you going to recoil? What if Siri pops up on your phone and you're like, whoa, hey, that's not what I thought that was. So it is that moment where you've started to say, well, how do we do that? How do we give you the visual representation? Because we like interacting with people, right? We want to do that. Now, some of us have said, well, I don't like calling a call center anymore. I really like being able to have a chat. But now we're also coming back to a call center that interacts with you. And if we have a call center, we probably want to put a face to that call center that isn't necessarily representative of any one of the individuals in the call center for some anonymity. But then again, how do I determine the face that I see versus the face that she sees versus the face that he sees? And can I give some flexibility to that? Can I give some intonation in the voice? So all of these are these subtleties we start working towards. And then the issue of, am I okay with that? Now, I don't know when we walked in here, and I didn't look for the sign, but in many conferences, you'll walk into a room, and I think I mentioned this to you, maybe you last night. There's a sign usually at these conferences, hey, you're okay with the fact that your likeness was somehow pre-recorded, like there might be a picture of you. You probably ignored those signs for most of your life when you go into conferences. But if you start thinking, now it starts to take a real gravitas. Because you're okay with the fact that somebody can take your digital image and do something with it. And that used to be like, what can they do with it? How bad could this be? And I start talking to people about creating digital characters and the responsibility. If somebody comes to me and says, we want you to create a character, they need to know that we're going to create that character. We're not necessarily going to take that character out for rent, except for Doug. You can borrow Doug all you want. Just see me afterwards. Because that has real meaning. I once got an email from a gentleman in Romania that said, send me $150 and a photo, and I'll send you a 3D avatar. And I was like, fuck, there goes our business. And then I thought about it for a second. I said, yeah, and then I probably will be doing porn in Eastern Europe not too long after that. And I used this joke many times. About 2 weeks ago, somebody came up to me and said, that actually happened. Not that I'm, no. Let me be clear. Wasn't me, no. But that actually happened to somebody. Their likeness was taken, and sure enough, you see the deep fakes, you see that starting to happen, where sure enough, some unscrupulous party took a likeness, and now that likeness is doing things that's going to be hard to claw that one back. So then it gets into an issue of, who do you trust to build? What do you sign up for? And where does it go? So all of these factors, as we think about virtual characters and creating those virtual characters, whether they be real or imaginary, all fit into this. So with that, thank you.